And here's the moment. So good evening, everyone, and welcome to session number 4 in the second edition of Rebellious Research, which is our monthly arts practice-based research seminar series. And I'm really delighted to have a double bill today. So we have Roy Hanney from Southampton Solent University and Ben Harbisher from Coventry University. And I'm just really delighted to hear these two talks. So what we're going to do today, we're going to do things slightly differently for those of you who've been here before. We're going to have about half an hour per person at the beginning. And at the end of the session, in the last half an hour, we're just going to have a nice dialogue between these two presentations, and we kind of bring the questions around what's going on together. So that's it from me. I'm just going to stop sharing my screen, and it's all yours, Roy.
Okay, let's see if I can operate this.
And of course, I'm going to ask Roy and Ben to introduce themselves before they start their conversation, their presentation. So if you don't mind doing that as well, that would be absolutely wonderful.
I actually can't see my presentation.
Yeah. Oh,
I can't see it. Oh, there it is. Right. Okay. So. Right. So can you, which are you seeing, the notes or the presentation?
I'm seeing the presentation.
Great.
The way it should be.
Brilliant. Lovely stuff. So my name is Roy Hanney. I'm Associate Professor of Media Practice at Southampton Solent University. I'm a course leader for our media production programme there. I'm going to sort of foreground this and say that I'm not an expert in practice as research. I'm probably more expert in practicing than the research side of it, and that's, I guess, partly what's sort of driving this talk I'm going to give is trying to get my head around how you do practice but pull out of that some research outputs or some sense of it being a research activity that satisfies the needs of academia. And so that's kind of really contextualizing it. So I'm just going to kind of introduce it a little bit and say I'm going to talk mostly about this project Cursed City Dark Tide, which I did in 2019. It was funded by the Arts Council. If you search thesnowwitch.com, you can find the website, and there is a very detailed account of the project there. It ran for about 6 months. It was quite sprawling. There were lots of elements to it, and it was essentially a sandbox project. And we had money from the Arts Council to have a go at doing a transmedia. And I'd never really done anything quite like that before. I think that I'd enviously seen examples of transmedias and probably what people would call ARGs. And so we wanted to have a go. And actually, I'd started teaching a module in transmedia producing as well. So there was a sense of having started teaching it and looked into all of that and done some research and developed that module. I wanted to actually do some practice as well. So I took this novel, The Snow Witch, by a local artist, a local writer. It's all set in Portsmouth. And we pulled out 3 of the characters from there. So the first one, Donitsa Kravich, who is the protagonist in the story. It's a contemporary setting, magic realist story. And in that story, in the original story, there was this character, Reynold Lisich, who's a shape-shifting trickster. So we pulled both of those characters out into our story. And then there was a final character who in the novel you never meet, because it's her death 20 years before in the novel that sets up much of the backstory. And so we brought her back into our story, but reimagined her as a ghost. So there were a lot of things that went on here that were sort of inspirations over the period of kind of building this. And one of them was No Theatre. And I had a fantastic time. I went to a big festival, No Theatre Festival in the King's Place in London, and fascinating. You know, this sort of very simple idea of a story. A traveller on arrival in a new location meets a mysterious figure who turns out to be a ghost. The encounter results in the redemption of the ghost and the onward journey from this plane. And that very much is what we built our story around, that idea, with those three characters. So part of the challenge here, and the reason for doing this practice, is you know, transmedia is a complex concept to try and communicate to people. It's not something that naturally sort of springs to mind as like, oh, that's it, when you try and explain it to people, not just to students, but also to practitioners who've never worked in that field. So that was one of the reasons to do this. And another one was to sort of try and think about how you conceptualize transmedia storytelling, going beyond the traditions, paradigms and tropes of linear narrative. So, you know, perhaps going into this, I probably had more of an understanding of screenwriting and story, but none of that, or some of it, but not all of it, apply in a transmedia setting. There's very much a decentering of authorship that goes on in transmedia, and people talk about the audience become the hero. So it's trying to understand how you build transmedia in terms of conceptually, in terms of story, but also practically in terms of the tools and the process tools that you would use, but also to understand theoretically kind of what it is as well. So it was very much, I guess you'd think about doing the practice would be an example of research informed teaching, in that learning to do transmedia is as learning to teach transmedia. And so in a way, what I'm talking about here is also a reflection on practice, but I would also say it is partly an exploratory speculation about the nature of practice as research, or practice-based research, or practice-led research, or any of those combinations of different terminologies. And I'm going to pick up on that in my conclusion. So this seems like a sort of fairly familiar thing. You know, there's the teaching that's sort of initiating this process. There's the practice, which I wanted to explore this and develop my own practice anyway in this field. But then there's the research, which is kind of also a personal interest, and they all kind of come together is this practice as research. That would seem fairly straightforward. I'm making a transmedia, it's an experiment, I'm going to learn all this stuff out of it, and so clearly that is research, I would argue. But question arises how you articulate a research question for this project, especially given that we're going to be employing experimental methods. It's going to be messy, uncertain, and we're going to be using techniques that are purposefully designed to detone authorship. In that, you know, part of what we wanted to explore is the idea not only that the authorship is contested in the experience, but also authorship is contested in the creation. And so we're also working through ideas about how you creatively and as a community create an author works collectively. And to a certain extent you think, well, why do we need a research question? And the reason we need a research question, and this is where we're sort of doing a bit of a thought experiment, I guess, is that if you imagined that I had a research supervisor, imagine I was doing a PhD and I said, I want to do all this, then the research supervisor is going to say, well, what's your research question? You've got to have a driving research question. And I go, well, I don't know. It's something to do with working out what transmedia is. It's like, well, I don't think that would fly, would it really? I can see Agatha sort of grinning there and going, yeah. and this kind of relates to this idea that you know, the research or the researchiness of practice research sits in academia, is kind of shaped by academia. and certainly some of the material I've read on this topic suggests that practice as research, or PAR, only exists in the context of academic evaluation, examination, or appraisal of some kind, so some kind of situational judgment that comes from the academic world. So to a certain extent, as a creative practitioner, I'm quite happy to not have a research question, but at the same time, as an academic, I'm quite intrigued by the idea that actually the question might emerge from the practice. And so how do you then do the practice if you need to have the research question first? So I mean, more typically, certainly in more sort of positivistic sort of realms, you might start a research project with a question or a hypothesis, you know, what is driving that research. But certainly with Curse City, Dark Tide, it's taken a further 3 years of reading and reflecting to arrive at a research question for one aspect of this project, actually. And I'm going to talk about one very specific, not minor, but still quite a small part of the overall project, which I have been thinking about and continue to think about. And it's taken that time to come up with some findings, and I could now go, well, actually, I could describe those findings and what drove me to that point of findings, and I could probably write a research question, but that all feels back to front, or is it? So let's have a talk a little bit about the project. And Agatha, please, if I go on for too long, please do wave your hands, because I can probably talk for hours about this. But the practice, I'm going to talk about the practice. I'm going to talk about the theory as two elements of this. So the Reynald Lissich character, the shape-shifting figure in our story, became a paste-up artist. Now, there's an interesting sort of genesis of that, because initially when I thought about it, I was thinking, oh, what we need someone, this character, to be doing some kind of urban magic. And I remembered that back in the 80s, early 80s, used to drive around Brixton, where I lived at the time, and you see all this cassette tape wrapped around lampposts, and people used to say to me, oh, you know, that's witches, Roy, recording incantations and then wrapping them around there and doing urban magic. Of course, you don't see that anymore. And I thought, well, so I can't do that. How can I transpose that? I thought, brilliant, graffiti. So I looked into that a little bit, looked at the synergy between that and these sigil markings that urban musicians do, and I thought, yeah, there's definitely synergy there. And initially tried to work with some paste-up artists in the city, because there was a sort of flourishing thing going on in the city at the time, and found them very difficult to work with. You know, street artists are kind of loners. They like to be out there on their own. They don't want to collaborate with anyone. They don't want to be part of an arts project. So in the end, I was forced to become the street artist. So at that point in time, I'm having to learn a completely new field of practice. I'm having to go out, do these paste-ups. I'm having to engage with this whole new community. So there's a real development in terms of my own personal practice, in terms of the materiality of the practice, in terms of the culture of the practice. And here's some examples of the paste-ups we did. Now, they were all of these things have codes in them that would have been decoded by the catchers, by the people involved in the show. And I won't go into that, but the point of the paste-ups was that this character in the story world was sending messages to the city and to the people in the city through the paste-ups. And I've got a little bit of a video you can watch here, and you'll see this first clip isn't actually me, but most of the clips you'll see here are actually me out pasting up around the city of Portsmouth, and then videoing it, or getting it videoed and then putting it on Instagram. And there's there's an interesting kind of historical thing here, which is worth thinking about, is that relationship between the street artists and the photographers, the catchers and the artists, has historically always been very symbiotic, in that the street art is very ephemeral, and without the photographers, it doesn't have it doesn't sort of embed itself in a sort of cultural history, as it were, or as a material cultural history. So, and I think that relationship between the two is important to what will come next when I start to think about the theoretical side of it. So these were all little clips I put out there, sort of trying to create this sense that there's some kind of fox character out there doing paste ups, and you might see him. And occasionally we would meet people who got quite excited, and if I didn't have the fox mask on, they'd be quite upset. Oh, hang on, I've just completely crashed the whole presentation there. So the end of the novel happens in the model village in Southsea in Portsmouth, and so we also got these little characters made and put them into the model village, and this was a kind of another way of trying to break down the idea of a story happening in one place. It could be experienced in many different ways. And of course, we were sort of putting it up on social media, mostly Instagram, and ended up running a paste up channel as well.
Sorry, Roy, could you re-share your screen again? Could you?
Oh, am I not sharing my screen now? There we go. See, 1 second.
Thank you.
So, right.
Yeah, you're back. Thank you.
Okay, so right, so the outcomes for the practice are for this particular element of the practice are clearly to do with working in a field of practice that I'd never worked in before. I haven't been a street artist, and for a while I was. I even after this, I even kind of ran a little paste up festival where we got loads of people send us stuff, and I'd go out and paste it up. So there's that kind of sort of a materiality of working in a new medium. There was all the stuff about working in a new community, a new culture, and how that culture manifests itself, behaves, the rules and regulations of it, the protocols of it. So there was a lot of things in there about working in a new practice, but also in terms of actually delivering that part of the project, working with other artists to make sure that we were communicating with the audience, and it was very live. So if we wanted to change some of the messaging that was going out to audiences, we would devise new codes, new puzzles, and then we would put them up, and if they weren't people weren't getting them, we would introduce clues and things like this. So there was also stuff to do with the process and procedure of delivering a live transmedia. So the next thing, after we delivered all this and we'd done all this and kind of done the reporting and got the money from the Arts Council and so on, we then ran a little symposium called the Evolution of Story, where we wanted to try and invite people who are interested in transmedia to come and meet and talk about this idea of narrative and story in transmedia. And we did that, and then that sort of kicked off what became the second phase of the project, which was the research, or the more academic research, the theory perhaps. And it partly started with this idea of the city as escape room, and that came out of a need to try and explain to people, students and creatives and others, quite what a transmedia is. And the really shorthand way of doing it is saying, imagine the city is an escape room, and that's it. And most people get that idea very quickly. Even if you've never done an escape room, you probably have a sense of it. You might have seen Crystal Maze, which is a sort of escape room TV show, isn't it? You kind of have a sense of it. So that's a really good way of kind of formulating it. But what that kind of connected with this book that I read and I reviewed for a journal, which was all about the revolution of transmedia storytelling through place, and talked about how the meaning of story is affected by place in which the story is told, and similarly the meaning of place tends to be told through stories. And this really certainly resonated with me in my kind of role as the Lisich, the paste up artist, you know, and the way that street art really works with place to reimagine place. And we're probably all familiar with that idea that street art sort of prefigures sort of all sorts of things to do with gentrification, whether that be good or bad. I also did this little game called Clued Up, which is out there. They do them all the time, and they do them in cities all around the country. And it was a really interesting experience, because the model for this is that they have these puzzles and they're designed to be able to lay onto any city map. So you could do the same thing. You could do the game in Portsmouth and it'd be the same game as in Manchester, but it would be laid onto a different map. And now the issue here is that what you're doing has it's not connected, integrated into place. It has no relationship to what is going on now, or what has come from that city. Now, the one I did was a Sherlock Holmes one, and you know, I live in the city where Conan Doyle lived, and he wrote a lot of his early Sherlock Holmes stories here. There's a real connection with Sherlock Holmes, but this story, this Clued Up game, had no connection with that at all. And I thought, well, this is really interesting, because what we did, I think, had real connection with place, whereas this didn't. And it sort of drove this dive into the sort of ecologies of belonging, and this idea of becoming with the city, and a thickening of place that happens when the story is enmeshed in the city in a meaningful way. And so I started to work with these ideas of effect resonance, effective atmospheres, thickening of place, and so on. And this led to two things in particular, urban foraging being one of them. And actually, what you start to realize when you think about this, and then think about it in relation to transmedia, is that this is what the audience are doing in transmedia. They are foraging for signs, clues, puzzle elements, essentially signs in the semiotic sense of them. They're foraging for signs. And then the other thing was the idea of the urban shaman. And again, you know, the sort of urban magic and mark making, these are all elements of effective resonance. But additionally, there's another level to this that's interesting about the shaman. The shaman crosses from this world to that world, and as a creator, you are creating the world. But as in my role as Lisich, the street artist, I was also crossing into that world. So I was actually taking a very shamanic role in creating those paste ups and putting them out there, while also creating the story. So this led me to this idea of symposis, which I sort of drew from Donna Haraway, and this idea of a symbiotic entanglement, where we use affective atmospheres to render experience. There's a co-creation of meaning, and there's a sense of belonging and attachment to place that comes out of a meaningful integration of the story into place. So outcomes of that is there's lots of sort of theoretical stuff there, which could feed into further work that could sort of that could be about how you construct stories, how you talk about construction of stories in transmedia, but also potentially, I mean, I've also already done a couple of conference presentations on this. I'm working on an academic paper. There are lots of clear outputs and outcomes on a very academic sense. But actually, what in the context of the discussion about symposis and entanglement, what comes out of this that is really interesting is a couple of things. One, the power of constraints. In both of those examples, I would argue that it is the bouncing off of obstacles, the bouncing off of challenges. So not being able to use audio cassette tape, so having to move to a different area of practice, trying to solve problems and trying to understand, well, you can't do this with a story in transmedia because the audience is the hero, so we need alternative ways of thinking about it. Or these are all kind of constraints which lead to opportunity and lead to new ideas, and I'm going to want to pick that up again in a minute. But also there is this idea of entanglement between theory and practice, which is also one of co-creation and symposis, where you cannot pull them apart. You can't really disentangle them. Although what I've done in a way was like phase 1 and phase 2, they are actually all kind of connected in, and it's very difficult to say, well, all of phase 2 was distinct and not part of what happened, and what happened wasn't part of leading into phase 2. And one of the things that happened quite recently, last week actually, I went to this talk by Anna Heinrich and Leon Palmer. They've just done this fantastic installation in a local art gallery. I went to the artist talk, and they were talking about how when they make work, these are internationally recognized artists, when they make up work, they have a vision, they have a artistic vision, they might have an intention, they might know roughly where they want to go, but it's in the process of the making that they will encounter obstacles and constraints. And they talked about how their encounters with constraint are always poetic, or they seek for a poetic response to the constraints. And I just thought, oh, this is really interesting. It almost felt like a light bulb moment. Maybe there is something about the poetics of constraint that could be that also plays with this idea of symposis as a way of articulating the research in practice. This book by Smith and Dean on this subject, and they talk about this idea of practice-led research and then versus researcher-led practice. And so you could look at the first part of my presentation about the practice-led research, the insights emerge out of the practice, but then you could look at the second part of it and say, well, actually the practice emerges out of the research. But this is really, is this not just reflection in action and reflection on action? And actually, I don't think for creatives, there is, you know, that pull between the two of them. When you're making, you are reflecting in action, but then you pause and you go and you reflect on action, but then they fold into each other. And I think that actually this is about moments of practice where there are these changes, these shifts. So I kind of was led to this idea of practical knowledge, where there's some kind of physicality or embodied doing that generates insights that can shift thought. And this is very much, I think, to do with that, the poetics of constraint, perhaps, and the symposis of co-creation of practice and theory, a double articulation between theory and practice, perhaps, where one is informed by the other and the other is informed by the other, and that you can't really separate the two out. So just to draw all of that rambling to a close, a couple of things that came out of preparing for this particular presentation, which really started as a conversation at the MeCCSA conference with Ben and Agatha, and there is a paper. I have actually written a mini paper which I have sent to Agatha. She can send it out. I will put it up as a blog, and I felt at the conclusion of all this that this whole practice as research thing suffers from a linguistic poverty. and trying to separate out practice research or practitioner researcher or knowledge value, these, and trying to separate all these things out is kind of almost I don't know, is a monomania. It just feels like a bit like, well, why are we even doing that? Because surely we already have a word for this, and that's artist. And that was the kind of insight that came out of actually preparing for this. And what will go forward from this is this idea of a poetics of constraint. And I've done a little bit of a cursory search for material on this, and I can't find anyone talking about it. So that might be my next dive off into the poetics of constraint, and whether there is something in there about the symposis of creative practice as a form of research, and that might give us some insights into how we articulate the meaning, value, the value and meaning of knowledge that's created through practice, if we even want to separate it out. So a few references, and that's me. You can find me on LinkedIn, Solent, Twitter, and sometimes to be seen out on the streets of Portsmouth, although not for a while now, pasting up post-ups.
Thank you so much, Roy. It was absolutely fascinating. You've managed to pack so many incredible and absolutely fascinating topics in just above half an hour. And I just really I struggle to decide which questions I want to ask you, because I have so many, and I have no doubt that many people in the audience as well. But I'm just gonna, again, I'm just gonna start with one thing, because you start your presentation with this idea of teaching being interconnected with practice and research, and it's really interesting, and I kind of map it onto this idea of expectations from academic side in terms of, you know, having research questions, and I guess we can say the same about methodologies, how sometimes they just developed in the process, but then you have to have them in order to apply for your funding or justify what you're doing. So I just wanted to ask you, how do you propose and plan to teach something which is actually in a process of being developed? Because you still have to respond to these ideas of, well, what is that you're going to be doing, how you're going to be doing, what is that you're going to be planning. How do you do this? What was your way to approach that? And I guess whatever it is that you're going to answer can be a kind of probably translated into the same response to kind of academic constraints of a different kind, but I'm specifically interested in the teaching aspect here.
Well, there lies the story. It's been, I've taught that module about 4 times now, and last year, I'm going to start by saying I don't think it's a module that I want to teach at level undergraduate level. I wouldn't recommend teaching transmedia undergraduate level. It's far too abstract a concept, and what I find is that even those students who, you know, there are moments where you can see them get it, the door opens, cross the threshold, and they get it, and the project opens up. But there are some that don't even want to approach the door. They don't even want to move in that direction. And one of the complex things about it is that it is absolutely an emerging practice. I mean, 10 years ago, you would have called it an ARG. And then 2 or 3 years ago, people were still using transmedia, but actually people are using that term less, and they're using more experience design. But then, you know, but what is that? Because that's now kind of exploding as a subject area, as LARPing is now becoming, is crossing over from weirdos in the woods bashing each other with swords to actually being like a commercial form of entertainment. So it is very challenging, and I think that whereas initially I started off being quite perhaps didactic, trying to explain it using theories and using case studies, is that I found that the best way to get people to engage with it is to do a much more problem-based approach, where you throw them in and see if they can swim, and then just occasionally throw them life belts and see if you can kind of get them to come to the surface and stop drowning, because it's really a really complex idea. I'm not sure that you can even teach something like that. I really don't. I'm currently sort of developing an idea. It's very early stages to do another transmedia, and it fills me with fear, the idea, because it's like I've no idea how we're going to even get to the point where we have a story, because any story we sit down and create, by its very nature, is going to be authored. And actually a good transmedia is not authored, it's authored by the people experiencing it. And all the people who are, if you look at the field, people who are top of their game in the world of experience design and transmedia, they're all psychology postgraduates. They've all got doctorates in psychology, and that tells you something really important about how media and the experiencing of media and the idea of co-authoring and immersion is shifting. It's shifting away from the idea of the creative, the writer, or the artistic scholar into a field of psychology and manipulation. Perhaps all art is manipulative. I don't know.
That's quite fascinating. I can see Carola smiling. Carola writes quite a lot about the idea of co-creation, and I know that Becky is in the audience as well. We had a really interesting seminar just about a week ago when we talked about the idea of co-creation, collaborations, and I know that Jess is in the audience as well, and he probably likes the idea of ecology of belonging and thickening of space, which for me as well maps into this idea that when you create something, the context of where you present it, that is already this idea of affecting the storytelling through place. It doesn't necessarily have to be a physical place in a city, but I'm just gonna, because I know lots of people have lots of questions. We should probably start Ben's presentation in 5 minutes, but Carola, would you like to go first?
Yeah, and fascinating. And I'm sorry I was a bit late. I came from another meeting actually. But this notion of, you had the slide up with reflection and action and reflection on action, and the practice led with the research led, and this notion of practice versus theory. Having grown up in Germany, where you have to decide on 2 different universities where you want to do music theory or music practice. It's very, very much apart, and that was what drove me actually to come to Britain. But the interesting thing that I find also as part of this debate is that it not necessarily is only theory and practice which is bouncing off each other. I'm beginning to really understand that this might be just 2 disciplines. So we had a project back in the 2000s, which was in relation to what we call creative pull, technology push, the creative pull versus technology push metaphor, arts and sciences working together right at the beginning, and how do we formulate that? And we realized that there's a similar process as in the practices research process, where theory and practice has to sort of dialogically intertwine, ideally in little steps. Sometimes you do more art practice, and then you have to catch up with the theory that informs the practice. But the same thing happens with technology and art projects, where quite often the artistic practice pulls the technology development nowadays, and the technology development sometimes pushes the arts practice. So it's 2 different sort of disciplinary domains. So I think that's an interesting part which you must then have experienced in your sort of transmedia or
you're absolutely right, and I think that's kind of where I'm kind of moving to in just to be a little sort of left field here. In Taoism, you'll all be familiar with the yin and yang sign, and people talk about Tai Chi. Tai Chi is people moving slowly apart, but actually the word Tai Chi refers to the movement between yin and yang. So as yang becomes yin and yin becomes yang, there's no sense that it's the movement. And I think that actually the idea of symposis, probably an idea of a poetics of it, is perhaps about the movement between them, and that's where the articulation probably lies. and the interesting articulation lies, because I think they are separate, but at the same time they are entangled, and that's the learning I think I'm taking away from it.
Yeah, lovely.
Fascinating. Very quickly, Angelina, would you like to go next, please?
Yes. Thank you very Thank you very much for the presentation. I found a lot of interesting ideas through your project. I mean, I have a question as a PhD doctoral researcher. So we talk about practice-led research, reflection in research, reflect on actions, which I feel very interesting ideas. So my project is practice-led research. So for me, lots of a lot of experimental creative practice is actually walking in the city, is observing, reflecting, connecting. So a lot of this practice outcomes is intangible. But as a PhD, they have to examine our outcomes based on the writing and the practice. So because I'm very struggling, because lots of the process for me I'm doing now is intangible. So it's hardly to convince people what is how my practice can account for half of the PhD. I mean, probably it's not very correct question, but I want to hear how's your opinion about it.
It's interesting, because I think I'm kind of privileged in a way, because I can do my practice, because I can get money. So far I've managed to get funding to do it, and I can claim it as practice-based research, so I can use some of my scholarly research hours to do that, and I can also at my leisure kind of evidence the research by doing some panels, doing some papers, and writing the occasional research paper if I can get it published. Whereas you are in a very different situation, and I think that is the more kind of academic idea of practice as research, and I wouldn't want to be in your shoes, because I really absolutely have no idea how you do that. And part of the thought experiment I've been trying to do with a project I've just done is there's a very experienced practice-based PhD supervisor at Solent University, and just as a sort of a friendly thing, I've been sending her this little 300-word research statement and saying, is this a research question? No. Is this a research question? No. But that is very much a thought experiment, because I'm trying to understand this project I've just done. What was the research question, and partly that came about because we wanted to get some peer review done of the project, and of course, if you're going to do that, you have to start with that 300-word thing, and I have to say that not only did the people doing the peer review not understand any of the ref guidelines on the subject, but I wasn't able to articulate a research question. So I wish I could help you with that, but I absolutely cannot answer that question.
I think this opens a lot of opportunities for us to continue this discussion. So, Jess, if you don't mind, just really, really briefly, because I want Ben to start in about 1 minute. Would you like to ask your question and we move on to the second part? Thank you. Oh, you're muted right now, so you probably might want to unmute yourself.
Okay, the wonderful modern technology. Thanks, Roy. I think we could probably actually continue with this question on email, if you don't mind, later on, because it's a bit of a complication. When you mentioned at the very beginning the sort of the paradox situation that you found yourself in, it suddenly got me thinking, what's the paradox here within the poetics of your practice within the ongoing academic work that you're having to do, and then recognizing now that it's suffering, as I understand, suffering from linguistic poverty? So I think that's probably an email question.
Well, yeah, I mean, just very briefly, I think that it's interesting that the question that's now morphing out of all this is more to do with what is this. It's less and less to do with the practice, and more and more to do with answering this question that's being driven by academia, which is how do we articulate the theory, or the research, and actually that it has personal interest to me, but as a creative practitioner, it has potentially zero value to me.
Yeah, okay, thanks a lot.
Lovely. I think I'm going to use some of the parts of this discussion to design some kind of follow-up from this. But without further ado, I would like to introduce Ben, or rather ask Ben to introduce himself. I know that Ben has been feeling a bit poorly today, so I hope you feel good enough to take the next half an hour or so, Ben. So I'm just going to pass it on to you. Thank you.
Thanks, Agatha. I might be sounding a little bit better now. Thanks, Roy. That was a fantastic presentation. Really, really good stuff as always. I've been cramming these things for the past 20 minutes. They're called Jakemans, if anybody's interested. And on the back of the packet, it says, once tasted, they will be your favourite soothing lozenge. I think they're woefully optimistic. And again, who has a favourite lozenge, right? These things are just beyond me sometimes. So, hi, I'm Ben Harbisher. I'm Associate Professor in Media Production over here at Coventry University, where I look after a number of courses, film production, media production, and our top-up degree in media. I'm also currently the acting chair for the Media Practice Network, on which I work with Roy Hanney here. And thanks to Agatha and colleagues over at the Journal for Media Practice and Education, we also try to provide referable outputs for the work that our colleagues provide for the MeCCSA Practice Network as well. Personally, I always have this great belief that if you put something out into the world, arguably it should have some use, value or purpose, particularly in terms of the furtherance of one's career wherever possible. I know that sounds particularly mercenary, but at some point down the line, there has to become a point where you just stop doing conferences because you really need to get some conferences under your belt, and you actually switch track slightly and decide that you need to get some publications under your belt as well. So in that respect, this is something that's already been published, the piece I'm about to deliver today. It's modestly well rehearsed. I'm a little bit on the creaky side, so you're going to have to bear with me. I apologise for this. If anybody saw my previous work that was delivered in MeCCSA earlier this year, it was a deep dive into one of the conspiracy theories that abounded during the pandemic, primarily the idea circulated by some members of the conspiracy fringe. In this case, somebody's going to tell me my microphone's off, aren't they? That's good. So I did a bit of a deep dive into one of the conspiracy theories, which was circulated by a figure called Kate Shemirani. I don't know if anybody's heard of Kate Shemirani. She's a disgraced former midwife, disgraced by the British Council of Midwifery for circulating rumours that the NHS was akin to Nazi Germany and during the pandemic was committing genocide. Utterly ludicrous accusations. But I thought it really deserved a deep dive into A, how it was managed by the establishment, B, the criteria. I mean, what on earth would possess somebody to make these claims in the first instance? And finally, was there any credibility in this whatsoever? So that's really where some of my earlier research came from. Let me just start the slideshow and I can explain the purpose for some of this work and research. I need to go back to the window I was sharing to resume this. Okay, let's have a look. Can you see my presentation? Yeah?
Yes, we can. Yes.
Super duper. Okay. So this is a piece called Nudge, Behavioural Science, Normative Discourse and the Art of Consent. So the story behind this, really, at the start of the pandemic, a close colleague of mine, Stuart Price, who runs the Media Discourse Centre over at De Montfort University, and has been proactive in the MeCCSA Social Movements Network for many years, had some amazing phone calls and very long, almost daily conversations during the pandemic, and we realised very quickly that it was there needed to be some serious academic interventions into the pandemic, not just in political terms, social, cultural terms, or anything else, but even just in terms of what's actually going on. So this generated one of our main ideas, which was we really need to get a book out soon. And the interesting backstory is that once we'd actually settled on a decent call for chapters, our competition over in Helsinki beat us to the draw and got their call for papers out just a week before us. But I'm pleased to say we got our book out 3 months ahead of them, and I'm in both of them. So I was quite pleased by that. The piece I just mentioned on eugenics was actually in Power Media in the COVID-19 pandemic. The piece I'm going to present today is in Governing Human Lives, Social Control Policies in Pandemic Times. So really, what is this all about? In terms of working methodology, a lot of my work I tend to borrow from the work of Michel Foucault, primarily to give it structure and methodology, which we all know is it's always something that ref reviewers look for in our work. But primarily, really what I wanted to do is explore this new field that had suddenly started to crop up very surreptitiously and very hush-hush a lot of the time in left-wing media coverage, this thing called a nudge unit, or nudges. I've never heard of this before, and I've spent a lot of my formative years in academia studying surveillance, organisations like GCHQ, MI5, MI6. So there is a very strong political leaning in terms of intelligence in a lot of my work. So I really wanted to interrogate this thing called nudge theory, and I needed a critical frame through which to do this. So I've worked with different methodological approaches, including archaeology and genealogy, Foucault's methods for excavating an archive of public discourse. Discourse itself, Foucault always claims, is the conjunction between a set of practices and concepts. So discourse can be something which is an act as much as it is a concept. And also Foucault's underlying concepts of normativity within discipline. Following on from this, I found a phenomenal study conducted by a guy called Philip Saracen. It's only a short essay online, but it was one of my favourite pieces of reading during the pandemic. One might suspect I had better things to do, but I didn't at the time. Philip Saracen wrote a fantastic short essay on Foucault and pandemics. And primarily the idea focuses on Foucault's epistemology, the idea that there are 3 different political ages. You see, now I'm talking about Foucault, my voice is starting to relax. This is clearly therapy for me. So we started to look at 3 different historical eras. Modern society, Foucault claimed, is comprised of 3 different historical moments: government, discipline, and sovereignty. And at different points in history, we've either had the sovereign regime, the object of which was to accumulate land and wealth, the disciplinary regime, which was to analyse and focus on the population, through to government. And Foucault would claim, as Philip Saracen, that the object for the governmental society, the one in which we now supposedly live, is predicated by security. So really what I wanted to do is have a think about all of these different ideas. 1, what is nudge theory and how can I analyse it and tear it apart and see how it works? 2, can I use Foucault's methods to do this? Both understanding that discipline can be, discourse can be both practice and concept orientated, and it's linked inimicably to a variety of different ideas historically and culturally. So really, Saracen comes into the mix in terms of how previous pandemics have been dealt with by these different historical regimes. Let's go for sovereignty first, because this is the easiest one to tackle. First and foremost, Saracen claimed that the sovereign regime's response to leprosy, as much as anything else at the time, was to either bash it on the head or kick it outside of the city walls and forget about it. Very much the response to policing at the time as well. During the disciplinary regime of the industrial era, Saracen thereafter claims, and interestingly enough, Foucault has written extensively about pandemics during his work. You've just got to look for it. Both Saracen and Foucault claimed that the Great Plague was interrogated. It was at the level of a population, scrutinised, interrogated, segregated, separated out. In more contemporary times, let's say, for example, the outbreak of smallpox at the start of the 19th century, this is an era which was largely outlined by the way in which a pandemic was put to work. What is the use value of something like a pandemic? And of course, nowadays we start to see entire industries based around not just health and welfare, but big pharmaceuticals, driving costs cross country. I'm going to be a bit tongue in the cheek in this presentation. I apologise. It might get a bit naughty here and there. Driving cross country to check your eyesight during the pandemic, perhaps. But there are use values for this as well. So not only do we have an entire industry which is now revolving around this, but of course we have antivenoms, antitoxins, cures, so on and so forth, antidotes. Anyway, thinking about the kind of resources, I've used a bit of LexisNexis for this research, but one of the pieces that I used, one of the pieces of research I really enjoyed using for the first time was TinEye. And TinEye is a great retrospective image-based search engine. You can throw an image into it, and what it does is it shows you every instance that image was posted online, within reason, but the first time, most importantly, the first time that image was posted. Now, I picked up on this from a Netflix documentary called You Don't F With Cats, in which a group of internet denizens basically tracked down and apprehended a wannabe serial killer based on him uploading videos of him doing really unmentionable things to cats, suffocating them, feeding them to pythons and things like that. Anyhow, cut a long story short, it's a really, really interesting little search engine. It's something that I've started to use increasingly in the kind of research that I do. So let's wind history back a little bit to the start of the outbreak, the pandemic. And let's briefly think about the graphical presentation of this. So this might not necessarily be practice-based research or research-based practice, but it certainly is me analysing other people's practice. Again, I did say it's going to be a bit tongue-in-cheek. So think about the NHS logo. Actually, this has only really been in use since the early 90s, and it wasn't in common use until all of the relatively, I wouldn't even say they were devolved because they weren't necessarily unified as separate institutions until the late 1990s, when common uniforms were introduced into the NHS. The use of this ubiquitous logo was introduced. But if we look at certain factors such as the typeface, the logo, the Pantone 300, the colour swatches that are used. Okay, let's start looking at the pandemic. 12th of March, we know things are getting bad throughout Europe. We know that Southeast Asia is starting to close down. Some of our friends and cousins over in mainland Europe are starting to close down. Boris Johnson here, Chris Whitty and Sir Patrick Vallance starting to make announcements to the general public. We can see the relatively subtle use of the NHS swatch here, the colour scheme being used on the placards here. 22nd of March, Protect the NHS, seemingly for the first time, is used as part of this triptych of stay at home. Protect the NHS, save lives. Moving on to the 23rd of March, lockdown begins 20-30 hours. You must stay at home, Boris Johnson orders. Unless, of course, you're going to a party ordering canapes or going for a drive across country to check your eyesight, or having an affair with one of your office PAs, seemingly all of which are perfectly acceptable for our current government. Notwithstanding, the 25th of March, this is really interesting. The logo and branding changes again. Can you spot the main difference in this? It's fairly straightforward. Okay, look at the colour schemes, yellow, blue, red. This, when I did a little bit more research into it, and what I tried to use TinEye to do, was match up the changing lectern colour schemes and design and layout and brands and everything else. What I was really trying to achieve with this was to work out what the key political messages or agendas were of the day. And Michael Gove here looking as relatively perplexed as one can expect if he's not dancing the night away somewhere in an Edinburgh nightclub. We actually see at the bottom of the screen here a very, very clumsy attempt to forge a coalition. Do bear with me a second. I'm not running away. I'm just plugging my laptop in. we see a very clumsy attempt here to forge a political coalition, which fell flat on its face in a matter of within a matter of hours. But if we actually read a little bit further, I know, Roy, you were talking about semiotics and interpreting images earlier. Stay at home, Liberal Democrats, protect the NHS, Tory values, we are the NHS, Labour, save lives. And then after this, once we settle into this new state of affairs, we start to see the graphics change. Here's one which is very much resonant of warning signs. Later iterations of this start to look more like an emergency livery from the side of vehicles. The branding and marketing arm of Parliament, Downing Street, is clearly working flat out. Here's actually a snapshot of all the different lecterns. So this was just really a note of curiosity that started some of my research at the beginning of the pandemic. Let's get into nudges. So where do nudges come into this? Nudge was a book originally written by Cass Sunstein and Richard Thaler back in 2008. Both went on to really quite formidable careers. Sunstein went on to work for Barack Obama's administration as one of his key political and administrative supervisors, primarily for communications. But it's also been picked up by figures such as Dr. Michael Holsworth, who runs the Behavioural Insights team, and also figures like Mandeep K. Dami, who was seconded to Porton Down Defence Science and Technology Laboratory for the MOD back in 2011. Both have used behavioural science fairly extensively, and the contemporary iteration of this seems to be called nudge theory. David Cameron, of course, recognised the value in nudges during the early stages of his time in Parliament, with the forging of a fairly uneasy coalition between the Liberal Democrats and the Conservative Party, and to the tune of which decided to use behavioural insights, potentially, theoretically, to give his campaign a little bit of a boost. We do know that the nudge, let me backtrack a little bit here. We do know that the Behavioural Insights team, informally known as the Nudge Unit in Whitehall, was also responsible for assisting in electoral campaigns, some of the background work on promoting Brexit. The wider application of this, it works primarily with the public sector interest in mind. It is a self-proclaimed, often social enterprise company. The BIT, or the Nudge Unit, works best in marketing and communications, and often for generating revenue services or for helping to manage public conduct. Think about that a little bit. Where does behavioural science fit into public conduct? Okay. The general type of things that nudges have been used for credibly in the UK over the past few years have been to ensure that people make alimony payments on time or child support payments on time, to ensure that people pay vehicle taxation on time and so forth, with credible margins of success. In my research, I liken, and there's a reason for this image on the right, I like to liken nudge theory a little bit to supermarket psychology, hence the picture of yummy chocolate bars here. And the theoretical premise for nudges is it's based around choice architecture. So in a supermarket, the general idea of using a liberal nudge is that you give people a soft push towards a desirable outcome. In other words, you maybe move the chocolates and put them on a higher shelf, and you put the oranges and other fruit at a lower level where it's within easy reach. People make that natural decision. It's good for their health and well-being. Paternalistic nudges are a little bit more enforced, whereby you may be asked to buy into one of two systems, like a pension system. You may have limited choices, and there's clearly a nudge towards a direction in one area or another. And this really relates back to behavioural psychology in terms of how automatic responses and reflexive responses both work. So in terms of what we call success modelling of nudges and behavioural science, we're talking about automatic and reflexive human instincts here. Automatic governs our fight or flight responses, whereas the reflective instincts are based on calculated rational decisions. They're controlled, effortful, deductive, slow, self-aware, but most importantly, rule-following patterns of behaviour. Now, the trick is really in nudge theory to try and get these rule-following patterns of behaviour instinctively embedded into the automatic domain. so that what you do is you translate rule-following patterns into something which becomes immediate and instinctive. Interestingly, artificial intelligence is now also being used to calculate the likelihood of success for key public messages or campaigns, and I think this is a risk, hence one of the reasons I was writing this piece in the first place. It's also achieved by repetition and peer pressure, as Thaler and Sunstein consider human behaviour to be influenced extensively by herd mentality. Hands, face, space. Can I say that again? Hands, face, space. How many of you have seen this, and how many times have you seen it, and how often has it become an automated response now? So the kind of campaigns, I may run over, Agatha, is that okay? Cool.
Sorry,
Okay.
yes, of course, yes.
Brilliant. So let's have a look at actually what Michael Halsworth and some of his colleagues did cook up during the pandemic. This is one of their main campaigns right at the start of the coronavirus crisis. Why can't we stop touching our faces was the main leading question for one of their think tank exercises. And really what they wanted to do was promote a number of agendas. One, how do you embed disgust in people at the thought of touching your face? I was really guilty of this. I'd be in the supermarket with my partner and she'd be picking things up off a shelf, standing there, pausing for thought, putting her hand next to her mouth. I'd do the same thing. I'd scratch my chin. And all of a sudden I became repulsed by what I was doing. Why am I touching my face so often? You become paranoid very quickly. It works. So we touch our faces a lot, but it's hard to think of alternatives we can switch to. Here, of course, we start to think about less risky substitutes, such as putting your hands in your pockets, elbow greetings. But the BIT, the Nudge Unit, also started to promote volunteer sign-ups during the vaccinations programme and combating PPE litter and so on and so forth. So let's move on to discipline and thinking about rebranding normal. Following the outbreak of avian flu in 2005, the World Health Organization started to plan for future pandemics. Once people get past their anxiety, their apathy, and start to take a new risk seriously, they write, the normal response is an adjustment reaction, a temporary fearfulness, sometimes accompanied by misplaced or excessive caution. But this is the teachable moment. Don't ignore it or ridicule it, guide it. Then we settle into a new normal. And this is how a new normal regime of practices was instilled in pretty much global society, but in the UK in particular. And the repetition of these values, I'll talk about norms in a couple of minutes. I will run over by about 5 or 10 minutes, I apologise, so I'm having to take it a bit slower than usual. So this is largely predicated by repetition of these core values. So we start to see during the early stages of the pandemic, populated by creative agencies such as Top and Guerin, who by and large are known for social and digital marketing campaigns, shock campaigns no less, and also out-of-home marketing campaigns. We start to see billboards such as the one on the right suddenly appear. Oh no, not you again. Effectively starting to shame people for being out in public. Sorry about that, that's my alarm telling me it's 20 minutes. I usually set one when I'm doing a talk. We start to see these kind of billboards suddenly appear everywhere, and these are all measured in terms of their impact. We can start to measure the impact of these. Out-of-home media specialist Talon, for example, was actually tracking the impact of the pandemic on the population movement, so footfall in designated areas. So when you start to put posters like this up, you can measure the impact on footfall. What kind of impact does it have on people's presence in public spaces? We start to see these posters emerge, gigantic billboards throughout the UK. Social media campaigns offered up by Top and Guerin Creative. It's called a social living room for a reason. Our NHS needs you. This one in the top right, I think, was a bit of a creative, well, I wouldn't even say creative fail. It was an all-out fail because very swiftly into the pandemic, flour starts to sell out. So everybody's very obviously staying at home and doing some baking. But it was very interesting that as the campaign evolves, the severity of the advertising campaign becomes more and more austere and threatening and pleading. But the colour schemes that are used, the impact that they hope to generate in terms of how they're perceived by the audience is really very interesting to look at. Discipline then. Normativity and discipline. This is where we really start to see branding the new normal, because this is how the WHO introduced the teachable moment. And for Foucault, this is all about norms and binaries, but it's not really about the normal and abnormal. For Foucault, this is about the norm. What is the actual norm that we're talking about? It's the norm that's the important thing. The norm here is appropriate conduct, or rather it's conformity. So how do you get people to conform to certain patterns of behaviour? And that's why I say in governmental terms, it's not about bashing people over the head. It's not about putting them in prison or trying to reform them. Actually, in terms of governmentality, it's about entrainment. It's about utilising a wide range of techniques and technologies around supervision, discipline, and a whole range of other governmental techniques to actually manage society. So, of course, these messages are disseminated via the mass media. In terms of conspiracies and control, we do see Ofcom regulation over the mass media. One of my favourite quotes from the entirety of the pandemic was that Ofcom would be used to police harmful but legal content and effectively censor all broadcast media. This is out there in print. I'm not making some of this stuff up. There is also the intended introduction of an online harms bill during the time. Didn't quite get off the ground. Instead, what the government did was it just made social media companies responsible for the content being posted by their users. But of course, in terms of reiterating normative social values, we start to see fantastic terms appear. I think this one was coined by tabloid pundit Piers Morgan, the notion of COVIDiots. I think that was a Piers Morgan trademark term during that particular period. So are you normal? What constitutes normal? Well, apparently social distancing. I remember having to be shepherded around supermarkets by marshals during the pandemic. That's relatively unheard of in my lifetime. Mask wearing, hand washing, buying responsibly, not stockpiling or hoarding, self-isolating, shielding, exercising once a day. So if we're to look back on all of these different, probably quite now iconic images of the things they represent and the behaviour that they were designed to instill upon us, you're looking at the cartoon on the right-hand side, I can tell. So why are nudges problematic? The reason I put this image on the right-hand side of the screen here, because this is subliminal advertising. Generally speaking, subliminal advertising has by and large been banned throughout most of the global north. It's relatively misunderstood, often misquoted, often misrepresented. But actually, I do have a big question. I have a fairly significant problem around the idea of nudging and coercing, albeit soft forms of coercion, coercing a population into behaving a certain way, whether rightly or wrongly that is actually there for their protection and well-being. Surely that reduces our capacity for freedom of choice. So where we have freedom of speech, by and large, we have freedom of movement. I think we might be entering into an era where we start having to think about freedom of choice or freedom of decision making, and need to question whether the decisions that we're making have been highly influenced or not. And I do agree, obviously, that by and large, through conventional advertising, most of the content we consume in terms of media is always going to be highly charged, whether politically or commercially, and profoundly persuasive. But I think nudges are something that's really quite new, very interesting, and potentially quite threatening, particularly if we start to match this up with artificial intelligence. Surely we're teaching artificial intelligence how to lie to us and manipulate us, and I think that's a dangerous thing. So I'm going to leave it at that point, actually. The longhand version of this, I do go into different responses to the pandemic, the sovereign and disciplinary. In general terms, really what I was concerned about was how far down the rabbit hole do we go? How far is modern civilization going to go towards returning to sovereignty? bashing people over the head again to make them behave or stay at home. That's really what the guiding question was behind this piece of research. We didn't quite get there, I'm glad to say, but it was really quite interesting to see some of the things that did happen, like the police surveilling citizens walking their dogs up in the Peak District, dyeing beautiful blue lagoons in the Peak District black to avoid, I mean, that's environmental damage, or it would be if it wasn't already a toxic spill. It's supposedly a natural beauty spot, but it isn't. I think, yeah, it was a very, very interesting period. That chapter is written in full in a book and goes into a lot more depth than 25 minutes will afford me today. So happy to take any questions.
Absolutely fascinating. Thank you so much, Ben. It's really interesting for me to hear you talk today, because I've seen your presentation in Aberdeen where you kind of talked about the beginning of this journey really, and now you really take it to another level here. It's just really fascinating. I was just wondering because you know, when you were talking, it made me think about so many things, because we're talking about some sort of paradigm shift. We're talking about obviously this new norm, and so we're also talking about I was thinking about research. I was thinking about Roy's presentation about how, you know, when we do something new, we obviously need to understand our context and understand our discipline, and Roy was talking about it as well. But then your presentation made me think, well, how many of the things we are new to and learning, how many of the things can we actually take for granted and asking, well, this is the way it is. So it made me also a bit more aware about, because you both mentioned semiotics, and obviously how small little details, or sometimes they're big details, have a very significant meaning sometimes, and they really will have some influence on the way people read your work or read the world around it. And made me very self-aware of, like, well, actually, maybe when we do our research, we have to be really, really careful and really think about all the elements very carefully. And that links again to another part of, sorry, this is a very long question, but because you kind of touched on so many fascinating things over there. Roy was talking about effectively context of presentation, and when he was talking about the significance of place. But really, it kind of makes me think also about, you know, how this really, again, how we can be related to the way we present our research again, and how the context is associated with specific ways of reading things. And it is to do with this kind of expected way of kind of understanding things. I hope it makes sense. Would you like to, it's more kind of, it's not really a question, but would you like to comment on those things I'm just talking about? Does it, if that makes any sense, what I was trying to say here? There's a couple of things over there.
Whenever you do a talk, always take a pen and a piece of paper with you. It's great to write questions on. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we have been through some fairly substantial and very, very important paradigm shifts over the past few years. I mean, the number of the really big ones during my lifetime, 9/11 was a very seismic event for the entire world, and a lot of things changed in terms of politics, society, our daily lives, our existence. I'm not going to talk about the surveillance state to any great extent, but in terms of discourse, how society is managed, how the world around us works, we move generally from an era which was largely predicated by just bare naked capitalism, really, towards the end of the 1980s, through into one in which society became the dominant discourse of its day. And we can see that particular regime reiterated in the entirety of our surroundings. If we look, for example, at football stadiums, where we have gigantic letters outside of football stadiums cast in concrete and iron, these are not exclusively there to promote the football club that's playing within it. It's there to stop vehicles driving into the football grounds, their security barriers. And what we don't always see when we're talking about this in architectural terms, we don't always think in terms of security and intelligence and infrastructure in the day-to-day kind of objects and things that we engage with. on a daily basis. So a lot of the research that I tend to do, I like to look in the places that people don't often like, that people often don't like being explored. Hence some of the research that I've done previously into MI5 and GCHQ and those kind of organisations. But you're right, there have been several paradigm shifts. I think we are either heading for, or we've already had a big paradigm shift in terms of AI and the integration of AI in politics. I think to one degree or another, we've had nudge theory, or a derivative of nudge has been with us for a very, very long time. This is something that in political terms, the Americans have been absolutely incredible at in a number of years in terms of their dual party system and the way in which the Americans run their electoral campaigns. But I do think that the increasing reliance on technology and artificial intelligence, the integration of both of these factors within our capacity as a general public to make informed and key life-changing political decisions is something we should perhaps be wary of.
It really is eye-opening, I have to say. I think AI is another absolutely fascinating subject, and how it's gonna influence us as researchers and creative researchers. I think we should also kind of be really concerned in a way, in terms of what happens. But I just wonder, this is maybe a provocative question. I don't know if it is, but I was just wondering if we can learn something from the kind of negative sides or kind of worries related to the nudge theory. Because to me, when I was listening to it, it was really frustrating how, for example, what we're trying to do as a community of practice-based researchers to find some kind of recognition, which is agreed by everyone, and how we have to struggle with this kind of things, and at the same time how we are being sometimes just pushed into agreeing to things which we might not want to. So I don't know if you think there is something positive we can take for us and make it work in a good positive sense for the stuff we do.
Yeah, it's really interesting. I mean, it's, de facto, I don't necessarily have anything per se against nudge theory. I think it's a fascinating field. I think behavioural science is a really intriguing subject to study and interrogate. I mean, as creative practitioners, we're all storytellers to one degree or another. And when you look at the practices of people like Thaler and Sunstein, who are developing concepts such as nudge theory, they're telling stories in a slightly different way, but their stories are impactful and they communicate ideas to an audience. So in a sense, I don't really see the arts and media as being something which is too dissimilar to behavioural science, because we're all trying to create a narrative and disseminate that, and for it to be impactful, whether it's, we're not practicing the dark arts in terms of trying to tame the population, but we are trying to communicate our ideas to an audience. I think, to relate to a point that Roy very eloquently made earlier, there is still very, very much a legacy of STEM and the way in which creative subjects are reviewed and still always cast and inspected or reviewed through the kind of STEM lenses of science, technology, engineering and maths, is that very old kind of, I guess, fallout from polytechnics and the revival of science and technology as leading curriculum subjects by this government and the previous one or two governments, in fact. And I think that kind of hangover really is something that the creative arts are still struggling to actually escape from under the shadow of, in terms of how we have our practice reviewed.
Very much so. I don't know if you'd like to comment or respond, Roy, in any way.
I think Ben said it perfectly. I don't think it requires any comment. It's like,
thanks, Roy.
Absolutely. And I think this is the thing that I keep bouncing around is that why am I even interested or asking the question about how you articulate new knowledge or value through practice? And it's absolutely only because of academia. Maybe a bit to do with funding, but to be honest, the Arts Council doesn't give a damn. They don't care. They want to know how many people got in, and you know, their impact evaluation is not really anything like the kind of thing that we would expect when we're as academics looking at impact and evidencing the value of what we do. You know, with the Arts Council, it's not like that. So why am I engaged? Really, just purely because of academia.
Really good comment. So I think we've reached 5 o'clock. I'm just going to ask, just in case, if anyone has a burning question to wrap it up for today. Is there anyone in the audience who would like to ask a question or comment on these 2 absolutely fascinating presentations we had?
It was absolutely fascinating. Just my thank you. And also, Roy, just on the note in terms of the Arts Council, I'm beginning to realize more and more how short the at arm's length from the government the Arts Council is. And I think when we hope to have a body that, you know, understands certain concepts like impact as we do, I think that we probably need to be aware that in current climate, there is the arm's length suddenly shortens quite considerably. So I am very much appreciative of the tension that bodies like that have to, you know, the organizations like that have to navigate. But, you know, that was just a thought that I had. But I found both of the presentations really fascinating. So thank you.
Right.
Thank you so much.
I think we're both concerned with nudging people to behave in certain ways as well. It was interesting as well.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much, both of you. I really appreciate your time. It's absolutely wonderful to have you here. And thank you so much, Ben, for you know, being able to talk for 40 minutes with feeling poorly. So I really appreciate that. So, and thank you very much, everyone. I'm gonna make this recording available probably by the end of today. And I wish you all a really lovely end of the year break, whatever it is that you celebrate. Have a lovely new year, and I will see you all at the end of January. We just gonna very briefly share one slide with the information about what's happening on the last Wednesday of January. So we have Catherine Gilbrady, who's going to be talking about filming the non-human, and that's on Wednesday, 25th of January at the usual time. So once again, thank you. Have a great evening and see you in January. Thank you.